Hello. What's up, y'all? I'm from Montana. That's how we talk. How are y'all doing? Are you awake? Are you tired? Do we need to do some yoga stretches? A little. I'm excited to be here, although I am just blown away by the brilliance of my colleagues. You have heard some great presentations, and so it's really hard for me to imagine what I could say that could possibly contribute to or top what they've already said. But I'm a philosopher by training, so we like to talk, so I'm going to give it a go. My topic is professional military ethics. You might be thinking, oh, we already talked about ethics this morning. John already talked about ethics. He did, but I have some more things to say. I have two confessions, though, to start with. One is I have, as you will notice, soon no slides. I would apologize for that, but I'm not really sorry for that. And as an ethicist, I do believe in honesty. I do have a movie clip, though, so I hope you will enjoy that. And as I mentioned, I am trained as a philosopher, which means I ask questions. I'm going to mess with your assumptions, and I'm going to make arguments, and I'm also going to make you think. So if by the time I'm finished your head does not hurt, then you're not doing it right. So just bear that in mind. So we're going to talk about professional military ethics today. You notice I use the term professional and not personal. So my other colleagues talked about how it was about you. Now it's not about you. All right, now we're going to tack back to where John started, to the profession. So this isn't a briefing. I've never given a briefing in my life. There's no PowerPoint. I'm going to take you through a line of reflection and argument, because I'm a philosopher. That's what we do, which is designed to get you thinking about what you will do or how you're going to be challenged this year. At points, there will be call and response, like my colleague Linda. I'm going to take you to church. I was married to a Lutheran pastor for 20 years, so it's hard to break those habits. But I also, my dissertation was on David Hume, who's a Scottish philosopher. He's a big believer in habit and practice, and so I want to practice our call and response. And much like I do with my kids or my students, if it is not up to standard, I will make you do it over again. So, and when I point to you, it's your turn. So, good afternoon. That was good. That was good. Y'all are good. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a film clip, and the film clip is part of what I'm going to talk about at the end of my talk, something that I call the narrative pivot. You heard a little bit about narrative already. I will define it because philosophers have to define everything, but I thought we would start with this film clip. It's from the Kenneth Branagh version of Henry V. And it's the night before the Battle of Agincourt, and the soldiers are having a discussion. Has anyone seen this movie, by the way? Show of hands. Wow, we're going to have to work on that one. Okay, we're going to work on that one. So let's watch this clip, and then we'll start.
Who goes there?
A friend.
Under what captain serve you?
Under Sir Thomas Erpingham.
A good old commander, and a most kind gentleman. I pray you, what thinks he of our estate?
Even as men wrecked upon a sand that looked to be washed off with the next tide.
He hath not told his thought to the king.
No. Nor it is not meet he should. I think the king is but a man, as I am. The violet smells to him as it doth to me. His ceremonies laid by. In his nakedness he appears but a man. Therefore, when he sees reasons of fear, as we do, his fears out of doubt be of the same relish as ours are.
He may show what outward courage he will. But I believe as cold a night as 'tis that he could wish himself in Thames up to the neck. And so I would he were, and I by him. At all adventures, so he were quit here.
I think he would not wish himself anywhere but where he is.
Then I would he were here alone.
Methinks I could not die anywhere so contented as in the king's company, his cause being just, and his quarrel honorable.
That's more than we know.
Aye, and more than we should seek after. For we know enough if we know we are the king's subjects. If his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us.
But if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make. And all those legs and arms and heads chopped off in a battle shall join together at the latter day and cry, oh, we died at such a place. Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon the debts they owe, some upon their children rawly left. I'm afeard that a few die well, that die in a battle. But how can they charitably dispose of anything when blood is their argument? Now, if these men do not die well, it'll be a black matter for the king that led them to it.
So if a son that is by his father sent about merchandise do sinfully miscarry upon the sea, the imputation of his wickedness by your rule should be imposed upon the father that sent him. But this is not so. The king is not bound to answer the particular endings of his soldiers, nor the father of his son, for they purpose not their deaths when they purpose their services. Besides, there is no king, be his cause never so spotless, can try it out with all unspotted soldiers. Every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul's his own.
Okay, and for those of you who haven't seen the movie, the hooded character is Henry, the king, right, in disguise. So this clip is an example of several important things that I think are related to ethical complexity. And I think this is really essential to think about if we're going to think of ourselves as moral people and leaders. And as John already established, you do think of yourselves that way. First, a moral dilemma or a problem. Second, this is an example of the practice of ethics, not just morals, and I'll talk about that in a minute, including ethical reflection. There's ethical reflection going on there. Professional judgment and discretion. They are thinking about what they are going to do tomorrow within the context of their profession as soldiers. And then finally, that's all going to lead to action. So those four things. But Professor, you might say, surely we're all adults and leaders, and we know what the right thing to do is, right? John already established this. We're all moral people of good character. Sure, yeah, that's right. I think, I don't know, right? But as John Meyer pointed out this morning, character in the profession of arms means particular things. It has its own problems and brings its own pressures and temptations to bear that can make moral action difficult. And so to go back to something that John talked about this morning, why is moral courage so very difficult, and why is there so much of a lack of moral courage? Why do there seem to be so few examples if we're all good moral adults? Well, I have the answer to that. The answer is because moral courage requires you to stand up against your own social group and peers, which as you rise in authority and responsibility becomes more difficult and more fraught. There are more and more social pressures, and you're standing up not against the adversary, but you're standing up against your own peer group. And so I want to really emphasize, to go back to character, character's not a one-shot deal. You are not done. I'm raising a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old. It's every day, all the time, whether I want to or not. And the same is true for you. Now, since I'm a philosopher, I have to drag an ancient Greek philosopher into this. So my choice for today is Aristotle. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle argued that to be a moral person required a lifetime of practice and habituation. And in fact, we couldn't even judge whether you're a virtuous person until you get towards the end of your life. We don't even know. So John shouldn't be asking that question yet, right? It's too early. He thought that virtue required two aspects, virtue of character and virtue of thought. John did a great, fabulous job on number one, so I don't have to do that. So I'm going to talk about number two, which I talk about in terms of professional judgment and discretion. And yes, I'm writing a book on that, so I get to make up my own term. But we'll get to that in a second. First, as a philosopher, language matters to me. It matters to conceptual clarity. And this is why philosophers are so annoying. There's a reason Socrates was executed. Aristotle was actually exiled lest he be executed. So we're going to define some terms, and my terms are ethics versus morals. The problem is these terms are often used interchangeably. They're not, and they're not the same thing. Often, especially in the military, ethics is used to refer to legal rules of conduct. And with all due respect to my JAG friends, love your work, love you, love you, love you. That's not how I'm going to use the term ethics. Okay, but let's start with morality, and if you're dozing off, this is the part where you need to wake up because the call-in response is coming. So morals or morality refers to claims, beliefs, ideas, and systems about what's right and wrong, what's virtuous, what's vicious. And those can be held by individuals, by groups, societies, or institutions. So if I say killing is wrong, that is morals. Okay, let's try that again. If I say killing is wrong, that is. If society says protecting innocence is the mark of a good person, that is. If the Navy core values are honor, courage, and commitment, that is morals. Those are all examples of morals. Okay, you gotta wake up a little, work with me. Ethics, or ethical, on the other hand, is a higher level of complexity, mental complexity, right? You've heard that today? It's a higher level of complexity of reflection, discussion, questioning, assessment, justification, and argument about morality. So ethics is doing those things about morality and elements of morality. So, time to wake up again, right? When you ask me why I think that killing is wrong, or offer a critique of my claim that killing is wrong, that is ethics. Very good. When I ask you about the implications, what the implications are of protecting innocence in a humanitarian intervention, whether those implications are good, that is ethics. If I ask you to explain why the Navy core values, as opposed to, let's say, the Army core values, are important, and explain what they mean or how they apply in a particular situation, that is? Okay, hopefully you can see the distinction between the two, but some of you are thinking, who cares, really? Which is my favorite philosophical question. Actually, my favorite question, I'm going to have to use a little French here, is who gives a rat's ass? So apologies for the language. That's a philosophical question. Who cares, right? Why does this matter? One presumes that you are clear on and adept at morals at this point in your life, right? That you have morals handled, that you know what morality is, that you have moral ideas and claims, probably some kind of moral system that you rely on. In your time here, we're going to ask you to go beyond that. Morals aren't enough. We're going to ask you to do ethics. I'm going to ask you to do ethical reflection and questioning, engage in ethical argument and justification, offer ethical critiques and assessment. That isn't just, I think abortion is wrong. We have to go beyond that, right? So what I'm going to ask you to do is engage in ethics of the grounds of your moral commitments, beliefs, and ideas, in particular that define the military profession. So we got the Navy core values. Who picked those? Why? Like, was there I'm serious, I want to know. Was there like a committee somewhere? Like, why'd they pick those 3? They only have 3. The Army, you know the Army's got 7, right? Just saying. So we're going to engage in professional military ethics, which is different than individual personal ethics or morality, understanding that when you took and daily affirmed the oaths to serve, you entered into a new moral community. It's a new moral community of practice with specific beliefs, ideas, commitments, and obligations that do not necessarily apply to other people. I'm a civilian. So I did take an oath of office, but it's not the same one that you took. When you took your oath of office or your oath of commissioning or what have you, you entered into a new moral community of practice, right? You took up moral obligations that did not exist before. As emerging senior members of this profession, you are both holders and changers. You are the holders of the traditions, values, and norms of this moral community of practice. But you are also the leaders of change when you discern with the other members of the community, sorry, you don't get to decide by yourself, that's indicated. So with apologies to Kenny Rogers, pretend like you know who Kenny Rogers is for my sake, right? So with apologies to Kenny Rogers, you have to know when to hold them and you have to know when to change them. That was the joke, it's okay. For which you need professional judgment and discretion. And that is really important. That brings us back to Aristotle. Are you excited? Because you knew we were going to come back to Aristotle. We need virtue of thought to be moral people, to be people of good character. He thought that prudence or practical reasoning was the virtue of thought necessary to be moral. So this is notable. He doesn't think wisdom, which all the philosophers love wisdom. He's like, no, that's nice, Plato, but that's not what you need to be a moral person. You need practical reasoning. And so in the context of professional military ethics, I call this professional judgment and discretion. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. You have to be able to engage in critical, complex thinking, reflection, and deliberation about, given the moral commitments and values of the military profession, what the right thing to do is in a particular professional context. This involves discerning the ethical aspects and dimensions of every situation, context, and decision. So ethics is not just on Ethics Day. It's all the time. It requires, but it's not limited to, critical thinking and understanding mental complexity and your own identity, self-awareness, as leaders as they apply to the ethical complexities and wicked problems that you will face. I hope by now that you understand you will be facing those, that's part of the job. So there are a host of issues. There's issues in relation to the ethics of war, whether that's a resort to force or the rules of conduct within war. In relation to the ethics of command and followership, the intersection of ethics and leadership. In relation to the intersection between strategy and ethics, yes, there is an intersection there. In relation to the ethical dimensions of the military-civilian relationship. In relation to the core values and the basic moral ideas and beliefs that define this community of practice, especially when they're in tension and conflict, which John already alluded to. The core values are great until they conflict, and they will, and they do. You'll notice, if you're still awake, and I think most of you are, so good job, that I have not listed in relation to your personal moral beliefs here. It's not because that doesn't happen or it hasn't happened already, but because professional military ethics, and I want to underline this as strongly as I can, is not about you. Well, it is, but it's not, right? It's not about your personal, individual moral commitments or beliefs alone. It's not to deny that you I'm not saying you don't have those things, but that's not what we're talking about here. You are an individual who's a professional and a member of a moral community of practice, and that's your anchor, that's your frame. Anchor, that's a boat thing, right? Did I get that right? Okay. My dad was in the Air Force, so I don't know from boats. The exercise of professional judgment and discretion is not the same as personal judgment. So I'm going to tell you a story, right? Story time. Let's say that I'm a professor at an undergraduate institution, which I was until earlier this year. I have really strong personal views on the use of laptops and phones in the classroom. I don't like it. I find it distracting. I'm a diva. The students should be looking at me. We should be having conversation. They should not be on Facebook while we're talking about Plato's Republic. That's my personal view. And it's in part my experience. I've watched my students. I see what they're doing on their laptops when they're there, and they're not engaging. Their papers are not as good. So I have personal reasons for not wanting laptops in the classroom. But if I'm in a department meeting and we're trying to decide what our departmental policy is going to be, in my role as an academic professional, my arguments about policy need to be framed not in terms of my own personal preferences, not in terms of my own personal experiences, but they need to be framed in terms of my professional role, in terms of my professional expertise and the shared values, norms, and standards within a community of practice. So this is about the professional, not just the personal, right? And I know that line it might seem like it's not as, if you want to push me in question time on that, you certainly can. It may not always be clean, but I can in some ways make an argument against laptops in the classroom by referring to those professional things. I also might make an argument in favor of them, even though I'm personally against them. Okay, so what exactly is this professional judgment and discretion? How long you got? How long we got? Oh, we only have 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna give you the short version, right? It includes deliberating about and assessing whether the end being pursued, and Linda Johnson sort of referred to this in her discussion about critical thinking. This is sort of the question of, are we asking the right questions? Is the end being pursued a good one? But also, what are the best means to that end within the norms and values of our community or our profession? We need to assess the viability and the possible consequences of the end, and also the various means under consideration. So this might include things like gathering information, reflecting upon experiences, and those could be your personal experiences, professional experiences, but this is where history might come in as well, right? That's a body of knowledge. Drawing upon prior knowledge and failures, whether those are individual or communal. Avoiding unexamined assumptions, right? Socrates said the unexamined life isn't worth living. And as a philosopher, this is something that makes me nuts, right? When people are trotting out an assumption they haven't thought about. So trying to avoid that. Self-deception and other traps like ethical fading and rationalization. John referenced the Garris and Wong study Lying to Ourselves, which came out of the Army War College in 2015. If you haven't read it, you need to read it now. Well, not now, after the Vice Chief talks, right? But you need to read it because we tell ourselves, as John said, all kinds of stories. And so I go to the store and I see a fabulous pair of shoes and I say, listen, I gave a really intense talk today. I deserve a treat, right? I deserve a treat. So you should be seeing, I'm hoping you're seeing some connections with some of the other talks that we've heard today, to self-awareness, to mental complexity, to critical thinking and mental agility and different ways of thinking, right? And as well as to a direct connection to what John said. This is all part of the piece of what you're going to be doing in the Leadership and Profession of Arms course, right? These are all pieces together. Okay, you're like, great, fabulous. How are we going to do that? Well, you're going to do lots of things like, writing papers and participating in discussions. But one of the things that's really important, I think, distinctive about this LPA core course is that we're going to lead you through personal development, a personal development process that will allow you to do this, to develop and hone professional judgment and discretion. And for today, you've heard lots of ways in which this is going to happen. Today, I want to lift up another one, which you might think I'm a little crazy, but it's thinking a little bit outside of what your box might be. And I call that the narrative pivot. So when we started today, we started not with PowerPoint slides, which are great, some pretty ones, but how did we start our conversation? A video, right? We watched a film based on Shakespeare's play, Henry V, right? And that's a narrative. There are lots of different kinds of narratives, blogs, memoirs, novels, art. I have a print of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which hangs in my office. That is a narrative. I love combat photography. I have lots of books. If you come to my office to visit, there's lots of combat photography books. That's another kind of narrative. Art is narrative. Hip-hop music is narrative. Country western music is narrative. Okay, maybe that's stretching things a little bit, right? These are all different kinds of narratives, right? And so I want you to think about what I call the narrative pivot. So what is a narrative, really? Well, a narrative is a story, but I think that sometimes we use that in a pejorative way. Oh, it's just a story, right? So if my boss, Dean Klein, I ask her how did her weekend go, and she tells me a little bit about some stuff that happened at home, someone might say, oh, well, she's just telling a story. Well, she's not just telling a story. She's framing what the meaning and significance of her weekend was. A narrative is a way to frame and develop meaning, right? That's what we do. She didn't tell me everything that happened this weekend. Trust me, she didn't, right? Well, because she's trying to frame her weekend in a certain kind of way to me, right? So maybe she was wanting to tell me about her grandson. She's not going to tell me that she took a half an hour to do her hair or something, right? That's not necessarily relevant, so we pick and choose. And if you have read the play Henry V and seen the movie, there are things that are in the play that don't show up in the movie, right? So a narrative is a way to construct meaning. And so I want you to think about this because I think narratives are critical and capture something essential, not just about the human experience, but about ourselves as moral beings. We can learn a lot about ethics and morality, both of those, right, by looking at narratives. Narratives capture the human experience. It captures emotion, empathy, care, pain, suffering, moral injury, inspiration, and aspiration. One reason I like that clip is it captures all of those things. It captures what the men are facing as they're about to go into battle. It captures what they are wrestling with, which isn't just an intellectual argument. We're talking about the medieval context here. So if the king's cause is unjust, they're committing murder, which is a big sin, which has implications for their soul and their future salvation in the next life. It's not some kind of, couple college students sitting around, after a couple beers, having a nice intellectual discussion. This matters to them, right? It's part of their meaning. These are a part of the process too. So what I'd like you to think about is what's your narrative? What is the story that's already been written in some ways, but then what is going to be written in this year, and what do you think you want to write going forward in the future? But of course, it's not just about you. What's the narrative of the people in seminar with you? They too have a narrative that has a past, that has a present, that has a future. What's the narrative of the Navy? And when you find out, let me know, where I'm still trying to figure that one out. Or the Army, or the Air Force, or the Marines, or your country's military, or your civilian institution, wherever you're coming from, what's the narrative of the institution that you belong? What's the narrative of the nation to which you belong? What are the future narratives? You've heard a lot in the last 3 days about what the future narratives look like, right? And they sound scary, right? So you're going to write your own. You're going to write on one another's narrative. So this isn't just about me writing my story, right? John is going to write on my story as well. And I'm going to write on his. And so part of the process of what has to happen in your 10 months is that you need to be open, not just to what you will write, but to what other people will help you write and what they will write on you. Because you notice we're like, this is not just one person in a room, right? There's a bunch of people here. We're in community. And so we're going to do it together. Okay. At the risk of violating protocol, I think I'm going to stop there, even though I don't have to stop here, because I would like to have more time for questions. So, is that all right? Okay. Questions, comments, observations, rebuttals, mutinies? It wouldn't be the first time. And maybe one way to think about that is, what did you hear that resonated? And what did you hear that didn't resonate? And then maybe to think about, what does that tell you about your assumptions? Because usually when I hear something that resonates, it's because it reinforces or appeals to an assumption I have. And when I hear something I don't like, it's often because it's rubbing against an assumption. Okay, questions, comments?
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
I'm Yanni Agrodimos, Navy commander from Greece. So you described ethics and morals, well, as I saw it, as a high-level motivation for our people to do the right thing and overcome low instincts such as fear or something. So I want your opinion, how would it work better, morals and ethics, as pressure from the society to the person who, such as not willing to be ashamed in front of the eyes of his comrades, or not willing to carry guilt, knowing that he hasn't done the right thing? Which dimension do you think is more effective? Thank you.
So the question is about, I take it as about someone who's not susceptible to the moral pressure. So I go home tonight, I have a 13-year-old, and he didn't do his chores. And I say, I'm taking your cell phone, and he says, I don't care. All right, so so I'm exerting some kind of social pressure on him, and he doesn't seem to care. The first thing I would just say is, I did try to distinguish, and hopefully I was clear that there is a distinction between morals and ethics. So morals is what I would claim is right, what you would claim is right, perhaps what your society claims is right, right? So those are moral beliefs and claims that are held by an individual, society, and institution. Ethics is reflecting upon that, right? So it may be that this person that you're talking about is not susceptible to shame. I'd be less concerned about that than I would be, are they susceptible to reflection? Are they willing to reflect on why they don't feel ashamed? They may have good reasons for not feeling ashamed because they broke some kind of societal convention. So I might have a friend who has decided she doesn't want to get married, right? And her mother's trying to shame her because you got to get married. Everyone's got to get married. That might be an example where we might say, yeah, maybe she's all right not to be ashamed of not getting married if she's sufficiently reflective about why she doesn't feel that shame, why she doesn't want to get married. Do you see? I'm hoping you can see there's a difference between saying, I think something is wrong, and then being able to reflect on that or justify it or be able to explain to someone else, how'd you get to that position? Why do you hold that position? Can you hear critiques of that position? That is ethics. But sort of going back to Liz's presentation, many people are in just the moral phase, right? This is what's right, this is what's wrong, because Jesus told me, Buddha told me, my mother raised me this way. The Boy Scouts say this is how we should do things, right? That's morals, right? My children can tell you that lying is not okay, right? Now, my 13-year-old can tell you why it's not okay. My 11-year-old is still working on that one. It's not okay because I'm going to get punished, which links directly back to what Liz was saying earlier. So I want you to appreciate the difference between those two. I tend to be, I understand that shame and social pressure is one enforcement mechanism that many societies use to maintain morality. My argument today to you is that that is not enough for you. You have to be able to go beyond that. I'm not saying you abandon that, but you have to move to the next level of complexity to be able to reflect, to ask questions, to do what the gentlemen in the video were doing. They were doing ethics. Do you all see that? These are not, except for the king, these are not necessarily educated people. They didn't go to college, right? They're foot soldiers, but they're engaging in ethical reflection and critique, right? They are thinking about whether or not the king's cause is just, not taking it on face value that it is, because the king said so, right? So that's a good question. Other questions or comments?
Lieutenant Commander Gurley, Navy, thank you for your speech. All right, so based on your definition, ma'am, do you consider General Petraeus ethical, professionally ethical, because he's able to reflect on his indiscretion? And then when it occurred, was it that he had a lapse in his ethics or his morals?
Well, gee, that's not a loaded question at all. Here's what I'm going to say, right? I think there's a couple of questions. I don't know General Petraeus, so I can only go on what other people have said. And we heard from our president this morning that he's gone through a process of reflection, that he's aware of what he's done, that he's wrestled with it, that he's conflicted, those kinds of things. So I think there are sort of two issues. We could ask whether the act that he did, depending on which act you're talking about, right, whether that was moral, was it right, was it wrong, right? So that's one thing we could do. We could also ask whether General Petraeus had a virtuous character. Was he a good person? So we might say, let's just say for the sake of argument, this is completely hypothetical, right? Let's say for the sake of argument, we say that his action was immoral. It was wrong. We might still say, but we think he's a virtuous person because, let's say for the sake of argument, we think this was an aberration. Perhaps a moment of weakness, something out of character. In other words, if we looked at the rest of his career, we looked at his other actions, and as I said, I don't know him, so this is purely hypothetical, but let's say that for the sake of argument, this was an aberration, because all virtuous people do things that are not virtuous, right? Because virtue isn't about perfection, right? You can never learn and you can never evolve to be a moral person if you don't do some things wrong, right? It's like walking. I've never seen a child that didn't fall down, right? Because that's how they learn about gravity and balance, right? And ethics is the same thing, or morals is the same thing. It's practice, right? So we might make those two distinctions, right? Does that make sense? But then we might say, listen, I think he's an ethical person, and that's not based on whether he did the right thing or didn't do the right thing. He's an ethical person in the sense that he's able to engage in ethical reflection. And let's say that he engages in ethical reflection. He understands that what he did was wrong and was problematic and unprofessional, and he regrets it. And if he had it to do over, he wouldn't do the same thing, right? I would be comfortable with, at that point, describing him then as an ethical person, because he's engaging in a process of ethical reflection and assessment and justification. Now, you could have a different scenario where he's engaging in ethical reflection. Did I do the right thing? And he says to himself, yes, I did the right thing. I was completely justified. It wasn't fair that I was punished, right? What I did was completely justified. Right? Is that still an ethical person? I would say no, right? Because you're engaging in some pieces of ethicality, but then there's some self-deception, there's some rationalization, there's other things that are going on, right? So that's why I want to separate these two categories, because we tend to use them interchangeably, right? And morals and morality refers to claims or ideas about what is right, about what is wrong, that an individual, a society, an institution might make, right? Whereas ethics is an ability to reflect, or a higher level of reflection or assessment about those kinds of claims. Right? So if you just say to me, if Belinda says to me, wearing red is just wrong, and I say, why? And she looks at me and says, there's nothing to discuss, it's just wrong. It's clear that it's wrong. And Liz is nodding her head and saying, I don't know what's going on. Like, what's going on with the new kid here, right? At that point, we're just engaged in morals. And if Liz and Alinda are not willing to engage in some conversation here, we can't. And I say to them, okay, well, why is wearing red wrong? And they're just like, well, it's just obvious that it is. Do you see? We can't move to ethics, right? But just because you are able to engage in ethical reflection doesn't mean you're necessarily a moral person, right? But being moral alone for the jobs and the profession that you are in is not enough. You have to be able to engage in that higher level of ethical complexity to understand the ethical complexity, right? As well as understand the moral foundation that the profession offers you. But I don't think, part of where I'm going with this is it's not enough to know what the Navy core values are if you don't know why those are the core values and why they're important and what does honor mean to you, right? If you can't articulate what honor means to you or what courage means to you or how it might apply in a situation, then we only have half of the story, right? And as leaders, people are going to be looking to you for that why. And I think several of our speakers, especially Professor Anderson this morning, said that really well, that quote that he put up about you're sending people to potentially die or be maimed. That's really powerful. They can't just be because the president told me that's what we're going to do. That's not enough. So I'm trying to persuade you that you're going to need more than that, the moral foundation, which is great, it's important, it's critical, but what we're going to ask you to do at this place is to engage in ethics, right? In reflection, in assessing and arguing about things in ways that maybe you haven't done to this point. Right? Other questions? Yes.
Dana Onifer, Navy Medicine. So, piecing together what we're talking about with the difference between morals and ethics, and hearkening back to Dr. Cavallaro's lecture talking about the self-transforming mind, and that I need to not be so wedded to a particular set of values. There's the opportunity for me to continually transform my morals and my ethics,
Right.
which ultimately could make things like targeting solutions really easy, right? Because if I rapidly transform my ethics and decide what's right and wrong on the fly, so what are the tools that I use to establish objectively right and wrong? What is ethical? What's the standard that we have? Because also, if we don't have that, then why am I fighting on this side?
Right, and I would say, I would disagree a little with the characterization of we're deciding things on the fly, because what I would take us back to, and maybe Liz can address this. I think part of what I'm arguing for is there are ethical standards, and those are bounded by the profession. Right? You belong to a community of moral practice which has certain commitments. One of those commitments is the principle of discrimination, that we discriminate between and targeting between combatants and non-combatants. Right? That's a basic commitment of the profession of arms, at least as it's practiced in the United States, right, and a great many other militaries. So for me, the profession and the professional values always are this sort of fence or this anchor or this touchstone that you keep coming back to, because it's not about, I think what Liz was talking about is really more about the individual, right, working through a process. And that has impact here, but you're not just an individual making targeting decisions, right? Presumably, there's other people involved in that process, and at the very least, you're making targeting decisions as a member of the uniformed military who works for me, not just me, right? You're doing what you're doing, not in your own name, but on behalf of the citizens of the United States of America. So that community of practice and those commitments have to bound, as a professional, what we're willing to do and not willing to do. And if you think about, maybe a good way to think about this is the other professions, right? So if you're in the medical profession, do no harm bounds or limits your professional judgment and discretion. You're going to always come back to that with your patients when you're trying to decide what's the best course of treatment for them, right? And you're not going to do things that are going to do them harm, because that's a basic sort of bedrock assumption or moral value of the profession. So one of the conversations that we need to have while you're here is, what is the profession of arms? What are those values? Why are they important? How do you think about those values? How are you going to live those values? Have we gotten to a point now with technology that some of the values and commitments we have as a profession perhaps need to change because they're not consistent with warfare that involves AI, right? So that's part of this discussion. But it's about professional judgment and discretion is not personal judgment and discretion. You are making a judgment as a professional within the bounds of your profession. So if you go back to my laptop example, right, I have to make my argument, I have to make my judgment as a member of the philosophy department about what is best, not just based on my own personal preferences, but based on the professional standards of our community. So let's say that for our community, a basic value that we have is that our education must be accessible to students of a variety of abilities. If I ban laptops in the classroom, students who need them because of some disability or some challenge they have will be effectively outed in my classroom. So I might say, as a professional, I need to not ban laptops in the classroom because of that professional, that community consideration, right? So I think you're raising a really good question. because with professional judgment and discretion, we don't want people out there just deciding willy-nilly, right? We don't want you just deciding whatever you feel like today, right? It has to be, that's why the profession, as John said this morning, the profession is what bounds this. It's what bounds what character looks like, and it's also what will bound what professional judgment and discretion looks like. It's a great question, though.
When I say on the fly, I mean, I'm being a little cavalier and accelerating
Sure.
the process, but over time, and sometimes not a long period of time, without those well-defined professional boundaries,
Yes.
our morals drift.
Yeah.
Or have
Yeah.
the potential.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and part of what you have to do when I said you're the holders and the changers of the profession, part of developing professional judgment and discretion is being able to discern when we need to hold that boundary. Is discrimination a boundary we want to hold as a profession? Since I've done a lot of my scholarly work on that, I'm going to argue I think you should hold that, right? I think that should be a red line, right? But there may be other things that need to change in the profession, right? As the character of warfare changes, or perhaps as society changes. I mean, we have integration of and have had for a while of women, right? That is a change, right? Is that a change to the profession? Perhaps it is, right? So you have to think about when are those times that you want to hold the traditions and norms and values, and when do you have to change them, right? And that requires not personal profession, discretion and judgment, but professional. And it's not just yours, it's in community, right? The philosophy department, we have to decide as a community what is best for our students, right? Even when I was department chair, I didn't get to decide, right? Any other questions? Great questions, great conversation. Anyone? One more? We could do one more. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Commander Snow, United States Navy. I'm going to reference General Petraeus, but it's not a Petraeus question. He said one of his top 5 threats to our country is the hyper-partisanship we see.
Okay.
And I think, without even getting political, you can see a device way of thinking in our country. If I'm talking to my priest, I'm Catholic, I'm going to make some assumptions that we share certain values, ethics,
Sure.
codes, morals, all those things. I have to assume, kind of like you alluded to, when I'm talking to other Americans, they may not share all those values, but at our core, I have to assume that we do have some of the same ones, right? Honor, courage, commitment for the Navy, but whether it's rule of law or the Constitution, maybe you could just speak to how you see some of those divisiveness we have, how we could come together as a country, because there does have to be some common ground we share if we're going to
Right.
get along. Thank you.
Y'all ask hard questions. That's so fabulous. I love it. Yeah, it's a great question. And we have 3 minutes, so I'm going to give you the short answer to that. I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion about having a shared sense of the common good, that's eroding, right? That we are in some ways reverting maybe back to some of those prior stages that Liz was talking about, where it's really the tribe or the social identification we have. So if I'm conservative, right, then I follow conservative blogs, I watch conservative TV, and that's mutually reinforcing the same thing. If I'm a liberal, and if you're a moderate, I don't know, are there still moderates? Maybe they're, confused, like where they hang out. I think there's 2 things. One, I think the profession of arms offers a place where we can have shared values, right? Given the approval ratings of the military, the trust that it enjoys, and John did point out that it can be transient, but I think there is when civilians in particular look at the military, they do see like a vision of some common values that, whether they're very liberal or very conservative, and there's exceptions, that they can endorse, right? So I think that's part of the conversation. I'd like to say that hyperpartisanship is a new thing, but then I think you should go read the Federalist Papers, right? Or go look at some of the election rhetoric from, say, 1800, right? it's nasty stuff, right? So I think this is part of our DNA, but the question is, how do we navigate that and how do we negotiate that? And part of it is attempting to come to some kind of common ground. But I agree with you. I think in the current environment, that's very, very difficult. In part because I think we focus on morals. This is what I believe, and we don't do much ethics. And having just come from an undergraduate institution, most of my students were very clear on what their morals were. But then when I asked them to engage in ethical reflection, like, that freaks people out. And it has to be done gently, right? With lots of video clips, right? And if my undergraduates can do it, y'all can do it, right? But it's really important because I think the military has an important role to play. Ethics is part of your expertise. Ethics, the character piece is part of your professional expertise, but so is professional judgment and discretion. This is part of what it means to be a professional, is not just to have the moral piece, but my argument is you have to be able to have the ethical piece as well, or you are not a professional, right? You have to have that expertise. Okay, fabulous. We need to stop, and I've been asked to have you all take a break, but in place. You're not allowed to leave. Thank you.